Hello everyone, and welcome to our Greek World review video. So to begin with here, we're jumping right into the deep end by figuring out a description of some of the most influential philosophers of the Greek world. And really the philosophy of Greece is broken down into three main phases, kind of the Ionian phase, the Ionic pre-Socratics, kind of the classical Greek philosophy, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Hellenistic philosophies, Epicurus, Zeno, and Diogenes. And really all of these philosophies can be seen as being another example of axial age thought, how all of them are really going after the same questions, trying to find the same answers, and oftentimes are either directly influenced or coming up with very similar solutions that we have seen in some of the previous axial age societies that we have touched on and talked about thus far. So it's once more kind of very useful to think of the Greek philosophy very much in line with the other axial age philosophies and religions we've talked about, just that oftentimes they're going at it from once more a different perspective and kind of a different angle. To begin with, you can really see that different angle with Pythagoras and Democritus, both of whom were very much interested in nature, in ratios, in trying to discover the functions and the elements and the nature of the world by looking at nature itself, by not trying to look for divine explanations or divine answers to everything. Not looking to metaphysical answers, but actually looking for physical answers. So Pythagoras, of course, very much involved in math and mathematics, and makes that connection between math and music. How the chords are broken down, and so forth, and that's really sort of his main contribution. Democritus is the first to really articulate the idea that the world, the universe, everything around us is made up of very tiny particles, which he called atoms. And if you think about it, this is still very close to how we now conceptualize the world today. The idea of kind of quantum physics, so to speak, where everything is made up of these very tiny particles. Of course, now we think there might be particles smaller than atoms and so forth, but Democritus seems to have been very, very close to sort of our current understanding, which is pretty remarkable, seeing as this was thousands of years ago. But yeah, that was his main kind of contribution, that looking at everything around us and realizing that everything could be divided into smaller and smaller parts until eventually you got down to particles that you could even no longer see, but that pretty much the entire universe was made up of these small particles combining, breaking down, and recombining themselves into greater and greater structures. Moving into classical Greek philosophy, you really see that these philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, are taking up that mantle of trying to find the proper place that people should fit into, the social function, the social context of axial age thought. So Socrates, really, in a lot of ways, his biggest contributions was the fact that more than any other philosophers we're going to be talking about here today, he wanted to question everything. Why are things the way they are? What is morality? If you think you're acting in a moral way, how do you know? What assumptions are you making when you come to those conclusions? So essentially what Socrates did is he wandered around Athens and he just asked a lot of questions to a lot of very important people. And when they provided answers, a lot of times he'd come back with even more questions and more questions, and oftentimes what would happen is that these political leaders or civic leaders or so forth, who felt very, very confident to begin with, very quickly realized through kind of the course of his questions that he was sort of stumping them or making them look silly or look bad or making them look like maybe they hadn't really had the answers to begin with, which created a lot of hostility towards Socrates, particularly among kind of the upper class of Athens, to the point, in fact, at which they decide to sentence Socrates to death. They pretty much accuse him of corrupting the youth of Athens. Of course, Socrates actually got a pretty large following in Athens of people who were just kind of watching him do this and liking sort of the mental gymnastics that he was putting people through. But sort of the elites of the town said enough of that, sentenced him to death, in which case he was killed. But you really sort of see that idea of questioning the way things are and how important that becomes, both at this time and future time periods as well. Plato very much so also fits in line with this model. He was Socrates' student, and unlike Socrates, he was able to avoid sort of getting on the nerves of the elites of Athens. But he was really able to really look at society and articulate what he thought the ideal society would be. Now, he had lots of other thoughts too, metaphysical thoughts. Essentially, he thought the world that we see around us, the world that our senses can perceive, is not the real world, that it's just sort of a shadow or a reflection of the real world. But that being said, he still had some very sort of practical political ideas on how this sort of shadow world that we live in should be run. And Plato's idea was that essentially society should be run by sort of a academic elite. The smartest people should sort of be these sort of gurus that made the laws and made kind of reasoned things out. What's the best course of action for society? And then there should be kind of other classes underneath them that would essentially help and support them. People would create food for them so that, of course, these sort of elites did not have to go out and farm for themselves. Warriors would sort of protect them. There would be this sort of warrior class underneath them that would protect kind of the elites. But essentially, sort of the smartest people should sort of form an oligarchy, so to speak, a small group of people running the rest of society. And that was sort of Plato's idea of the ideal scenario, and of course that would be sort of in opposition to Greek democracy, at least Athenian democracy that he was currently living in, where essentially sort of random people could either be elected or randomly chosen to fill government positions for a set amount of time, and that of course it wasn't open to all citizens, a relatively small section, but Plato's philosophy would have narrowed that down even more to a very sort of select few that he thought should be the ones running everything. Of course, it's not surprising that, of course, he probably would have placed himself in that particular category, and probably, was looking around Athens saying, "I could run things better than the people around here are." So, not too surprising that he sort of took a look around and said, "Well, I think that I could be doing just as good a job as anyone." Aristotle then took some of the same ideas as Plato, once more a student of Plato, and expanded them even farther. And Aristotle was interested in things like politics and metaphysics, just like Plato was, but he really brought in some of those ideas of the Ionic pre-Socratics as well, taking a look at natural phenomenon, and writing very, very extensively on a whole litany of subjects, from politics to biology to astronomy to religion and all sorts of thoughts. And really, because he was so prolific and wrote on so many various topics, really his ideas become very well preserved. A lot of his texts are preserved. And eventually, once the Roman world and eventually the post-Roman world converts to Christianity is very comfortable with Aristotle's ideas. In a lot of ways, they felt like it sort of supported their own worldview, so they picked it up, and in a lot of ways, when you get to the medieval time period in Europe, a lot of that knowledge base was based on sort of Aristotle's ideas and Aristotle knowledge. So ends up becoming very important. Of course, he's also the tutor of Alexander the Great, and sort of helps Alexander with his philosophical mindset, and sort of gives him the persona of this philosopher king that he wanted to fulfill. So very much kind of influential in the political life as well. All right, moving on to the Hellenistic philosophers, Epicurus, Zeno, and Diogenes. And with these three individuals, I think you really see the impact of Alexander the Great's conquest and this changing, more global perspective of the Hellenistic world. Of course, this is after essentially Alexander the Great was able to make his empire get in contact or touch up against India, and you're really going to start seeing the influence of these sort of Indian Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, these kind of ideas reflected in a combination of kind of traditional Greek philosophy. So Epicurus, for example. Epicurus is not just influenced, like I said, by kind of traditional Greek philosophy, really Democritus in particular, sort of becomes his guide. And he expands on this idea of a universe constructed of these tiny particles. And he reaches the conclusion, based upon the idea that everything is based upon particles which are combined, are broken down and recombined, that life is transient, that nothing lasts forever. In a lot of ways, he sort of rejects the idea of an afterlife. He says, no, when you die, the particles that make you up are just going to go back into the universe and recombine to form something else. So Epicurus' solution to this is saying, because life is transitory and we only have one shot of it, we should try to make ourselves as happy as we can during the one life that we have. And that becomes his main goal. The people in their lives should try to become as happy as possible for themselves and for those around them as well. Now, later critics are going to take a look at Epicureanism, at Epicurus' ideas, and really sort of take it out of context and sort of twist it. And they're going to make arguments like, well, it leads to overindulgence. It leads to bad morals because you're lusting, you're after food, after sex, after things that are not good for you or good for society, and it's a very sort of selfish philosophy. But that's not really looking at what Epicurus actually says. Epicurus actually argues that overindulgence is bad because it doesn't, in the end, lead to happiness. He says if you eat way too much, you're going to get sick, you're not going to feel well. Long term, you can get overweight, something like that. He would argue that that would actually not lead to happiness. According to Epicurus, really what leads to happiness is much more finding that kind of middle path, living in moderation, not going too far to one extreme or the other. And if you think about it, it actually resembles the idea of Buddha's middle path quite a bit. This idea of not completely giving everything up and living in poverty and self-sacrifice and self-torment. But at the same point in time, he's not arguing for completely throwing all morals and all ideals away and just doing what you want. He's saying, no, there has to kind of be this balance in there, and that only by discovering that balance can one sort of find true happiness and then truly live a life that fulfills that desire. Throughout time, though, that philosophy becomes very threatening to eventually other emerging religions and philosophies. Christianity in particular really not like Epicurus and the later iterations that you see of that in the Roman Empire. And there becomes a lot of backlash, and once more a lot of those sort of narratives of the destructive force of Epicureanism gets created during that time period. But in a lot of ways, they're not really talking about Epicureanism. It's kind of a straw man argument of what they perceive that to be. All right, moving on to Zeno. Zeno's main philosophical idea is Stoicism. And once more, you can see a lot of parallels here between Stoicism and, I would say, Hinduism, because Zeno's big thing is fulfilling one's place within the universe, that everyone in the universe has a place, and that you should try to accept fortune and misfortune and the things the universe throws at you completely evenly, that you should not get too high or too low, you should not get too sad, and you should sort of accept what fate has in store for you. Fighting against fate, he would kind of say, is like a fish trying to swim upstream, that it's not going to lead to happiness or good results, you're just going to tire yourself out, and that only by acknowledging your place within life and within society and accepting that will you be able to find peace and happiness. In a lot of ways, very similar to that idea of dharma and karma that we talked about last week in Hindu philosophy. And the last of these is Diogenes and the philosophy of cynicism. And cynicism would really have a parallel, I would say, in Indian philosophy with Jainism. Diogenes really identified, very similar to Jainism and Buddhism, that really unhappiness comes from attachments and material attachments and attachments to the physical world. So Diogenes' solution to this is to give everything up. He goes about naked, he doesn't wear clothes, he doesn't own any possessions, he doesn't have a house. There's actually this story where he was using this wood bowl to drink out of until he sees a young child at the side of a river using his hands to drink. And he is just disgusted with himself because he is actually using this bowl to get water that is kind of a luxury that he doesn't need. So he takes the bowl and smashes smashes it on the ground. So this entire idea of trying to separate yourself from anything that has any kind of attachment, because from his philosophy, or the philosophy of cynicism, you can't lose anything that you don't have. If you want to think of the idea like the Shakespeare would later touch on this, where he says that it's better to have loved and to lost than to have never loved at all. Diogenes would say that's a bunch of BS. It's much better to have never loved than to have loved and lost. He said because the loss is the part that really makes people feel bad. So if there's no attachments that people have, there's no way that they can get bogged down and feel sadness when something is then taken away from them. So he says people should not start families. They should not have any kind of political ambitions. They should just try to live out their lives as simply and plainly as possible. So in that sense, very sort of similar to the self-deprecation of Jainism, right? And the self-denial of pleasure and of worldly material objects. A lot of parallels. So it's very interesting to see how these other philosophies that we've learned about in this class are really coming in and combining themselves with sort of traditional Greek philosophy, but also very much taking a new perspective on it. Whereas Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were all very interested in people's places within society, and within particularly the polis, right? The idea of the city-state. Epicurus, Zeno, and Diogenes were all essentially arguing for a removal from those sort of attachments. And that's part of that Hellenistic shift that we're going to be talking about in a future question coming up here. But that should give you a pretty good breakdown of some of the things I was looking for in your list of the various philosophers. Alright, so moving on, comparing the cultures of Athens and Sparta, and what would you consider to be the pros and cons of living in each society? I think a lot of people did a very good job looking at Athens and Sparta and pointing out some of the stark differences. First of all, the governments were very different, right? That Athens had this sort of early form of democracy where the citizens, at least male citizens, people who owned property within the city of a certain status, would all have an ability to voice their opinion in making decisions and fulfilling important offices and so forth, whereas Sparta was essentially an oligarchy, essentially run by elderly men of status who would then choose two kings among their group to rule at one point in time. So governmental systems are very different between the two. Of course, culturally they're very different, whereas Athens is very kind of cosmopolitan, very open, very involved in trade and philosophy and the creation of new ideas. Sparta is entirely dependent upon the sort of social engineering that they are engaged in to try to create sort of this master group of warriors. That, of course, is entirely driven by this fact that Sparta had the largest slave population in Greece, right? The Helots living underneath them were essentially doing all the agricultural work and all the grunt work so that the Spartans didn't have to do it. But at the same point in time, the Spartans treated them pretty poorly. And it's not surprising that they were constantly in fear of the Helots then revolting and rebelling against them, essentially because there was a lot more Helots than there were Spartans. So the consequence of that is that Sparta takes on this sort of very bizarre and develops this very bizarre, very focused culture on producing kind of these, like I said, these sort of master warriors where children were taken away at a very young age. You saw some of this in the document exercise. Trained in kind of a barrack setting, removed from their parents and other family members, kind of raised communally, pitted against one another from a very young age in very harsh conditions to try to make sure only sort of the strongest survived. It talked about in the document that even young babies were, if there was some sort of physical deformity or they don't think they were going to be strong, would be exposed and killed. And it's not surprising that over time Sparta eventually ends up having some very, very big population problems, which if you want to think about the pros and the cons side of things, certainly comes down on the cons for Sparta, that it's essentially they created a various cultural practices that were just not sustainable. Same thing with pretty much giving up and abandoning all forms of sort of artistic creation and even kind of functional creation, to the point where they couldn't even make their own weapons or repair their own armor anymore because that kind of craftsmanship just wasn't valued. And also they couldn't really trade for it because, of course, they were very against trade. So in the long run, you see a lot of Spartans, kind of the way that they set up their society, which seemed very, very advantageous to create these great warriors to begin with, Again, after a few hundred years, there starts being some very serious problems with it. Of course, there's lots of inequality within Athens as well. There's still a slave population within Athens. A lot of people pointed out the difference between the way genders are treated in both societies. Where in Athens, women are essentially still within this very sort of patriarchal system that we've been talking about, and we've seen replicated in a number of societies, from China to the middle, to the Mesopotamia to here in Greece. We're going to see it more next week with Rome. They're very much within that same mindset where women are essentially kept out of the public sphere, where they're oftentimes not allowed to participate in government, they're not allowed to own property. A lot of times very much under the control of either their husband or another male family member. Sparta, on the other hand, women had a lot more freedom. I mean, essentially because men were so often off by themselves, training or doing whatever, they had the freedom of really just sort of being left alone, that they could kind of do whatever they want. They didn't have men constantly looking over them, and because of that, they were able to fill sort of more parts within sort of society that men couldn't fill, because really the only thing that the men were doing was either being warriors or training to be warriors, and not a whole heck of a lot else. Also, women were sort of very much valued for their own physical strength and physical prowess and their ability to have, bear the kind of strong, healthy sons. So, in that sense, it's still very much sort of a male-dominated society where, they're still sort of looking at the only purpose of women is really to make strong men. But in that sense, because they are sort of so committed and so dedicated to it, a lot of times Spartan women do have a lot more autonomy and freedom than you see in other, both Greek cultures and other cultures that we've been talking about. So you see a lot of pros and the cons coming down on both sides of this. Whereas Athens oftentimes becomes more wealthy. There's more education within Athens. There's the creation of more philosophies, kind of the creation of a different governing form. Whereas in Sparta, they just had really kick-ass warriors, and I guess that would be a pro. Also, of course, the pro for the women. But there's really a lot of cons that come with it. I mean, I'm completely convinced that if I lived in Spartan society, I wouldn't last very long. And a lot of people who probably would have been in the same situation, who just, for whatever reason, are not, able to become great warriors, really would not have it very well. Also, that's assuming that if you were in Sparta, you were going to be a Spartan and not a helot. That there's a lot of cons, of course, if you're going to be a helot, because essentially you're in this very brutal slave system. So, interesting ways that people sort of looked at and articulated various pros and cons to each of these cultures. And another thing to really kind of keep in mind as we talk about things like Greek culture, for example, in a lot of ways that is kind of our perception that we are looking back and imposing, because if you'd ask someone from Athens and ask someone that's from Sparta at this point in time, they would recognize that they couldn't be more different and really not consider themselves the same group or the same people at all, or to a very small degree, and that really it's only kind of looking back at it that we sort of constantly are grouping them together as part of that same sort of overarching Greek culture. Alright, moving on. Alright, our quotes. I thought everyone came up with some really good quotes here, a lot of good quotes on the website. I'm not going to comment too much directly on these, because I thought all of you did a really good job kind of explaining why you thought those quotes were great. A lot of people chose quotes from Alexander the Great. One that came up a number of times was, he'd rather, fight an army of lambs led by, or an army of lions led by lambs than an army of lambs led by a lion, which I think is pretty interesting and really sort of, I would say, in a lot of cases reflects kind of the modern understanding of kind of a military structure, where you want people who are going to be following orders, except for the people who are at the very top, who are kind of the strongest people at giving those orders, right? Also, a lot of people gave quotes from Pythagoras as far as kind of the humming and the music of the strings. Some very good quotes from Archimedes and Thucydides. So yeah, overall, very good job with the quotes here for number 3. All right, so what advice did we have for Alexander the Great? Of course, he just defeated his arch-rival Darius III of Persia, and he now controlled an empire which stretched over most of the world that was known to the Greeks. I mean, essentially, he conquered all the way from the Mediterranean to India, at which point in time he turned around because India is really far away and they have war elephants, and his troops were kind of like, no, we're done. So they pretty much forced Alexander to turn around, which by some accounts he was not too pleased with. And really, that kind of is sort of the mystique of Alexander, right? He's this great warrior and this great conqueror, but because he died so young, he never had a chance to really establish any kind of permanent state. And in order to do so, he would really need to conquer and tackle these problems which we are talking about. A lot of people had some very good ideas. Some people thought that he should really sort of try to replicate the efforts of Cyrus the Great, which we learned about a few weeks ago. The fact that he should try to very much sort of keep the societies that he was taking over intact, and just sort of set himself up as the figurehead, but still honor their religious beliefs, keep their sort of social structures in place, and just incorporate the elite of that group into sort of the elite of the Macedonian group, rebuild the temples if he need to in the various locations that he takes over, and so forth. So I thought that was some pretty good advice, that Cyrus was able to create a long-lasting empire, even though he conquered it, his empire, almost as rapidly as Alexander conquered his. The fact that the Persian Empire was able to last such a long period of time, and even though Alexander really kind of breaks up the Persian Empire here when he conquers it, the Persian Empire never goes away. Very quickly, and partially probably because Alexander died so quickly, his empire gets broken up into smaller pieces, and within a couple hundred years there's going to be a new group coming in, combining their traditions with traditional Persian ruling system, and the Persian Empire is going to get several more iterations from this time period going on. So I think the idea of trying to base it off of the originator of the Persian Empire would be a very good idea. A lot of people also talked about using sort of the cities that he was creating along the way as sort of administrative centers. I thought that was kind of a cool idea, sort of restructuring or utilizing the Persian satrapy system. That worked very well for them as far as controlling a very sort of diverse empire. And I think in a lot of ways what people were suggesting are things that Alexander was actually trying to do. I mean, towards the end of his life, you do see him sort of making these attempts to reconcile the Macedonians with the Persians, right? He has that sort of wedding ceremony where he tries to marry sort of his generals to the Persian women who are of an aristocratic class. He takes the Persian wife for himself. And you really sort of see that he's trying to combine his empire with the Persian Empire to kind of create something new. A lot of his generals, of course, didn't necessarily care for this. They kind of thought that they should be at the head, and that they wanted to preserve sort of their Macedonian heritage, and didn't necessarily welcome the introduction of Persian culture to the degree that Alexander wanted to create it. But I think if you were going to find any success in creating a stable empire, if Alexander had not died, that would probably be the way to go about doing it, because it's pretty hard to conceive of a long-lasting empire being created if you do not take into account the very strong systems that have already been established and in play within the Persian Empire for hundreds of years at this point in time. As it was, of course, he ends up dying, his empire ends up fracturing, and as I said, essentially the Persian Empire comes back within a few hundred years in different iterations and different forms. They kind of become the main political rival of the Romans and later the Byzantine Empire, and all the way up until the point of the introduction of Islam, as we'll be seeing here in a few weeks, and how really the Abbasid Caliphate and some of the very prominent early Islamic empires were essentially based on the same Persian ruling system and ideology and so forth that had come for, at that point in time, almost 1,000 years, up until their point in time, over 1,000 years. So interesting thoughts, and I thought people did a really good job trying to give good old Alex here some solid advice. Well done. All right. So finally, 5 things. What are the 5 most important differences that you notice between classical Hellenic Greece before Alexander the Great and Hellenistic Greece, Near East, after the death of Alexander the Great? And of course, one of the biggest areas I think people noticed a difference is geography, right? That the Hellenic world is very much defined and confined to pretty much the Greek peninsula, the Adriatic Sea, portions of the Mediterranean, and then kind of the coast of Turkey, kind of that Eastern Mediterranean world, essentially, is where kind of the Hellenic world is. Of course, after the conquest of Alexander the Great, that world becomes massively expanded. It now includes most of the Persian Empire, Mesopotamia, includes Egypt, includes places in North Africa, a much wider larger, broader world that the Hellenic world is than the Hellenistic world. But all of it, of course, is still kind of coming back to that conquest of Alexander and how he is along the way mixing the cultures of Greece with these cultures of the Near East. And really, the Hellenic world is pretty much the story of those mixings. You talked about also the difference in government and governing form, how most of the Hellenistic world was defined by sort of large empires, much more closely to sort of the classical Near East ruling style than the traditional Greek polis, right, and the Polish ruling style. And of course, a lot of people did a good job explaining how this sort of becomes an ideological crisis for people living in Greece, how so much of their traditional culture and religion and mindset was based upon the polis, based around their city-state, and how once the city-state is no longer fulfilling kind of its governmental and political purpose, it really starts to lose its identity, and people within those city-states start losing their identity once it's just essentially these large monarchs who are ruling over many different polises and many different cities and many different city-states. This, of course, has a big impact on religion as well. Hellenic Greece, once more, very, very much is based upon the city-states and geography of the continent of Greece itself. You have places like Mount Olympus, the Oracle of Delphi, even tracing things back to like the Trojan War. These are all things that took place, in Greece in the immediate vicinity. And a lot of times, for example, every city within Greece would have its own patron god, its own patron deity. A lot of the religious festivals and rites that they would be conducting were based upon which city-state they lived in. Now, suddenly, if you have Greeks who are living in places in Turkey, living in places in Mesopotamia, living in places in Egypt, those same religious ties don't really hold as much water, and it's really hard to kind of replicate those in cities that are not, sort of inherently linked with those very kind of personal gods within the Greek peninsula. Also, there's a lot more pressure because they're going into areas where there are tons of religious ideas already. We talked about, kind of the classical religions of Egypt, classical religions of Mesopotamia. We talked about Zoroastrianism within the Persian Empire. Judaism is also being operated in some of these Hellenistic cities and Hellenistic towns, particularly within Judea. So there's this huge mixing between Greek religions and other religions, and you kind of see this happening in the creation of these sort of fusion gods. You have Tyche, the goddess of luck, for example. A number of other gods are sort of mixtures of sort of traditional Near Eastern gods and Greek gods, and really sort of being articulated in a new way, but no longer are they so closely associated with specific geographic locations or specific cities and so forth. And it's sort of a time period of, I would say, sort of real questioning of sort of the religious foundations that Greeks had been running on. Of course, there's a difference in philosophy, which you talked about, how a lot of the Hellenistic philosophers are reflecting those ideas that they're now coming in contact with from other places in the Near East, whether or the other places of South Asia, India, for example. So that there's their shift there. There's also the shift that there's a lot more money being put towards patronage of the arts, patronage of science, patronage of engineering, and how people are making advances in science. There's the creation of these kind of libraries that are sort of a way for these monarchs to show their wealth and their prestige. But the end result of all of this is that there's kind of a real flourishing of knowledge and science and philosophy all happening in the Hellenistic world. And not saying that didn't necessarily happen in the Hellenic world, but it's only, I would say, increased throughout the Hellenistic time period. So those are a lot of the kind of key ways I would say that Hellenistic Greece is different than Hellenic Greece, and some of the key areas that I saw people bringing up throughout the week. All right, we're going to leave off there, and we'll then switch over to looking at our document exercise, once more taking a more in-depth comparison between Athens and Sparta. I love these two documents because they really do a great job of exemplifying a lot of things that were talked about in the PowerPoint and making a pretty clear contrast between Athens and Sparta, and how
Ultimately, despite being part of kind of the same Greek culture, they ended up becoming very, very different societies. And I think people really picked up on that. Grading wise, once more, the biggest thing to think about here, and the biggest area where some people lost points, is that you're just not providing enough examples. You need to be writing down quotes from the documents themselves. You can't just say that Sparta focused more on the military. You have to tell me where in the document it says that and how it's discussed. Those are the ways you're going to start getting more points here. So make sure when you're going through these documents that those are the things you're thinking about. You're not just telling me, you're showing me how the document that we read applies. It seemed like a few people were simply taking what was in the PowerPoint and trying to put that into their answers for the discussion questions. And that's not going to fly. You have to actually show me that you have read these documents and incorporate specific parts of the documents into your answers. So if you have any more specific questions, of course, about how to improve your grades, what more you could be doing, what you could be doing differently, make sure to contact me and let me know, and I can go over on an individual basis, with your answers to the PowerPoint questions, where you're at, and how you can potentially improve upon there. So make sure if you have any questions that that's what you're doing. But just to highlight a few areas here that a lot of people did bring up in their answers. And a lot of people did have very good answers to these document exercises. And it starts really right off the bat here, looking at the life of Lycurgus and Sparta in general, and talking about how he declared an outlawry, or declaring illegal all needless or superfluous arts. But it says that here he might almost have been spared his proclamation, kind of saying that the Spartans had pretty much no interest in these in the first place. So once more, we kind of see the formation of a very austere society here, right? That doesn't want any kind of thing that's superfluous, and they're here for kind of a specific purpose. Moving on, it says that there's no more means of purchasing foreign goods and small wares, and merchants sent no shiploads into Laceonian, pretty much Spartan ports. So pretty much saying that because there weren't these gold and silver, jewels, and money, not because this was not allowed, that people had no interest or reason to trade with the Spartans, so they pretty much stuck away. So Spartans much more isolated than what we're going to be seeing occurring with Athens, right? Very much more self-contained. And we really start looking more at kind of the social engineering aspects of this. That in order to the good education of their youth, he went so far back as to make consideration the very conception of and birth and regulating their marriages. So once more, that these are some very strong kind of cultural engineering that's going on here as far as regulating people, regulating their behavior, regulating how they're going to behave. And there's more examples of this down below here. See, nor was it lawful indeed for a father himself to breed up his children after his own fancy, but as soon as they were 7 years old, they were to be enrolled in certain companies and classes where they all lived under the same order and discipline, doing their exercises and taking their play together. So pretty much that people could not raise their children as they wanted to, right? That this was going to be the state taking the children from them and raising them up in that model. A lot of people did bring up the fact that Spartan women did have more rights in the ancient world than a lot of women had. And certainly the social engineering that was going on around them had a big part to do with that. I mean, a lot of it was the men were so focused on the lifestyle that they were being expected to lead, that the women were, for the most part, just kind of left alone. If you see here that their wives, whom they obligated to leave absolute mistresses at home, took great liberties and assumed the superiority, and were treated with overmuch respect and called by the title of lady or queen. It goes on to express how the Spartan women were expected to have healthy and strong bodies for the bearing of strong Spartan children. And that this was all kind of what went into kind of having them have a higher status within Spartan society than other locations. Even though still, they were supposed to be fulfilling these roles and not have a lot of choice within the matter either. So it's hard to make that big of a leap as far as them being that much more, I would say, socially equal than other places in Greece, but there is certainly a difference that you can see between them and Athens, for example, where women were supposed to be kept out of pretty much all public and religious functions, and were certainly not included into the conceptions of the state in nearly the same way as what you saw within Sparta. Some more ideas here and some examples of how the children were then raised. To the old men who were spectators of their performances and often raised quarrels and disputes among them, meaning the children, to have a good opportunity of finding out their different characters and of seeing which would be valiant, which a coward, when they should come to more dangerous encounters. So pretty much making children compete against each other and fight against each other in order to strengthen them up and to see who's going to come out on top. So probably in certain cases a very abusive childhood for a lot of these children who were subjected to a lot of this, not just from the adults who were supposed to be training them, but from their own fellows who they were kind of kept in competition with. And there's plenty more documents that kind of go into more detail about this. But certainly, growing up as a Spartan child does not sound like it would have been a very pleasant, a very pleasant thing to go through for the most part. And just talking about in general, even after he was a full-grown man, no one was allowed to live after their own fancy, but the city was a sort of camp in which every man had his share of provisions and businesses set out and looked upon himself not so much born to serve his own ends as the interests of the country. And of course, this is ultimately the goal of everything that Spartan's doing, right? And I think it's important to remember that even though it sounds like there might be some push towards egalitarianism and equality amongst the Spartans, you have to remember that the entire point of this push was so that they could continue to rule over the Helots, rule over their slaves. The only reason that the Spartans really constructed this entire social engineering that they came up with was to continue to control a much larger enslaved population. So as much as it's easy to kind of see them as having certain aspects that seem like they might be more egalitarian, for example, the treatment of their women and trying to make everyone within society the same, it's only within Spartan society and not within the larger society of people who lived within Sparta, because there's an entire class of people, the Helots, who are being left out of this equation, who are not included into this, and were subject to even more abuse by the Spartan people. So something to keep in mind when we're talking about the Spartans as a whole. But you can certainly see that they become one of the kind of prime examples of what social engineering can potentially do to a society, and the very extreme lengths that a society can eventually take itself in order to fulfill a particular goal, a particular function, and that when it becomes ingrained in the culture, it almost becomes self-fulfilling to a certain degree. And certainly it can get to a point where it becomes detrimental to the survivability of a culture. And I think you see that with Spartans, with the fact that a lot of these practices led to much lower birth rates, and the fact that the city-state had a much harder time populating itself than other city-states did. The abandonment of all the arts and the crafts and so forth meant that they were having eventually a hard time even repairing and providing themselves with functioning armor and weapons and so forth. So a very kind of complex scenario here going on with Sparta. Compare that to Athens, which certainly is a much more kind of cosmopolitan city, and certainly is well aware of that. And Pericles here in his funeral oration is making everyone know that. Our Constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Its admirations favors many instead of the few. This is why it is called democracy. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. In no social standing, advancement in public life falls to reputation for capacity. Class considerations not being allowed to interfere with merit, nor again does poverty bar the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition. Now, you need to take this with somewhat of a grain of salt. Of course, women were completely excluded from the state and were not included in this. And really, this is speaking only to the citizens of Athens itself, which oftentimes would not include individuals who did not own property or did not own land. So there would be a class of people who was going to be excluded from this, including servants and slaves as well, would be excluded from this. So once more, just like in the case of Sparta, even though this sounds like something that might be very egalitarian, it's still only talking about a certain group or certain percentage of the population. But certainly they're saying that one of the reasons that they are different is that they are much more open and accepting in the decision-making process than neighboring states. And this was written in a time where they were in direct conflict with Sparta. And this is one of the aspects that Athens is trying to kind of focus on and draw a comparison between themselves and the Spartans, who are still at this point in time run by a couple of kings as well as an oligarchy, right? So this is one of the ways that Athens is trying to compare themselves to the Spartans. They go on, further, we provide plenty of means for the mind to refresh itself from business. We celebrate games and sacrifices all year round, and the elegance of our private establishments forms a daily source of pleasure. So once more, a very stark contrast with Sparta, which is all pretty much all business, all about training and maintaining itself. Athens is pretty much bragging about here how, hey, we have time for business and for fun. We don't find anything wrong with with having a good time, with celebrating, and with not organizing ourselves like the Spartans do. Next sentence down, they get into the idea of trade. We throw open our city to the world, and never by alien acts exclude foreigners of any opportunity of learning or observing, although eyes of the enemy may occasionally profit from our liberty. So really saying how they're a much more open society than the Spartans, much more engaged in trade, and really admitting here that this might, in some cases, hurt the Athenians, but saying that they're willing to make that sacrifice in order to have a much more kind of open society, at least for some. We have the double. This next sentence here is good because it really takes a direct shot, I would say, at the Spartans and their way of life. We have the double advantage of escaping the experience of hardships in anticipation, and of facing them in the hour of need as fearlessly as those who are never free from them. So pretty much what this is saying is that Athens has the ability to face hardship when it comes up without having to live in hardship. That's pretty much what they're accusing the Spartans of doing, constantly making themselves live in hardship to prepare themselves for when war occurs or prepare themselves for hardship in the future. Athens is saying we have the ability to have fun, to not live in hardship, to be an open society, and when there's an hour of need, we'll come together fearlessly then to meet that, but there's no reason for us to pretty much place hardships upon ourselves for the preparation. So kind of an interesting comparison here that he is making with their enemies at this point in time, the Spartans. And really, I think that the beginning of this next line here really shows you how there's a fair amount of kind of a Athenian exceptionalism going on here in Pericles' speech, and which makes a lot of sense since this was a speech for the people of Athens. But in short, I say that the city, we are the school of Hellas, pretty much the school of Greece, that they're being, being so open, and that they're really kind of having a very, very high opinion of themselves and their governing system. Of course, the Spartans had the same aspects as well. But these are just a few aspects that people pointed out and that I wanted to bring up to show you as differences between Athens and Sparta right here in a couple of documents. Just really kind of exemplify and show these differences, how they occurred, and a lot of people came up with some pretty good answers too, as far as why these differences would occur. I think it's important to note that the main reason that they were allowed to occur was because there was this independence that was so central to the Greek city-states, and that there wasn't any kind of, even though there was a common culture and a common language, there wasn't a common ruling system or political system ever formed or put in place, really until you get down to the time of Alexander the Great. And that, in that sense, even though that they were at that point being able to be considered part of the same culture, they had very different cultures at the same point in time, looking at each individual city-state. And you can really see why Athens and Sparta eventually came to blows, which ended up weakening both of them to the point where, Macedonia was able to come down and pretty much take over the Greek world from them to a certain degree. All right. Well, good job, everyone. Thanks a lot for listening to another week, and I will talk to everyone tomorrow. Next week. Let's try that. All right. Bye-bye.